So thank you, everyone, and for joining in. It's sort of a somber attendance today, but and which is why we are sort of double glad that all of you are here. Thank you, and welcome to the fourth and final event of the UAC and Reliance Foundation Women Connect India Challenge Speaker Series 2. Our topic, as you know, for today is data collection, analysis, and impact measurement for gender digital divide interventions. Uh, M&E or monitoring and evaluation, as we all know, is a critical aspect of international development intervention. So, one of my previous bosses had once said that, if you haven't documented and measured the impact of the work that you're doing, you basically haven't done any work. So, through the Women Connect Challenge, all of you have adopted some of the M&E requirements of USA Reliance Foundation, and today's discussion, in a sense, sums up your experience in that regard. We will see a snapshot of the prevalent global M&E practices, including aspects which are relevant to M&E requirements for USAID-supported projects as well. And some of the discussion points from today will hopefully also expose you to some ideas for strengthening your organizational M&E practices. So as audience, we have representatives from awardee organizations of the Women Connect Challenge India 2021. Uh, we have Mariam today from USA Indo-Pacific office, Ravi from DAI, Ruben, along with Ruben and me, and we also have our colleagues from Dev Global. Thank you everyone for being here. Uh, as you know, my name is Ritesh Datta, and I'm the Gender and Technology Advisor at DAI. I'm your host. And so, so basically, to first facilitate the conversation on this topic, we have with us today, like I mentioned, Mr. Ruben Grangard. I hope I get your name right, Ruben. He's the Director Mel for Digital Frontiers in DAI, overseeing monitoring, evaluation, and learning for the entire project. Prior to joining Digital Frontiers, Ruben had worked at the U.S. Institute of Peace, focused on improving MEL for peacebuilding and governance programming. Ruben has also worked at Mercy Corps, designing rigorous impact evaluations for a vast portfolio of projects. Ruben's academic training is in development economics. Thank you, Ruben, for making the time, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Ritesh, and good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to the folks in DC. It's great to be here with you, and I really look forward to the session. So let me share my presentation real quick, and please let me know if you cannot see my screen. All right, so I'm just going to quickly walk through the agenda for today. I think it's always a little bit of a challenge when you put together a session on monitoring and evaluation and learning.
Metro?
Oops. I think there's somebody on the line. If you can mute yourself, that would be great. It's always a little bit difficult to put together a session on monitoring and evaluation and learning, because I think we come with very different experiences. Some of you might have quite a lot of experience, and some of you might be new to this topic. And so we're going to try and sort of hit everybody where they are, but that can be a little bit of a challenge. So we're going to start out by talking about what monitoring, evaluation, and learning is, and why do we do monitoring and evaluation and learning. Then we're going to move into project logic, talk a little bit about that, and in particular talk about the theory of change and how that can help us sort of flesh out, articulate our project logic. We're going to talk about indicators today. Then, if time allows, we're going to talk quickly about a couple of common measurement challenges that we have, specifically, not necessarily specific to digital development, but to international development as a whole. And then we're going to wrap it up with talking just a little bit about some tips for USAID MEL. And it's great that Miriam is on the call today, and maybe we'll have the opportunity to hear from her here as well. Okay, so let's start off with a little bit of a background on what it is and why we do monitoring, evaluation, and learning. Before we do that, I just wanted to we were originally planning to do a quick poll here, but I think given that we're not that many folks on the call, I would just ask all of you to write into the chat essentially what your level of experience with Mel is. Are you very experienced? Do you have very limited experience with monitoring and evaluation and learning? Just curious to get your thoughts on that. So if you can add kind of your thoughts on your level of experience into the chat, that would be super helpful. Let's just give ourselves a minute to do that. Great, thank you, Rohini. Large scale implementation, but still limited experience with monitoring and evaluation and learning. Rehamat, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, saying that use Mel for data-driven decisions within the project. Okay, and Smriti has 3 years of work experience in monitoring and evaluation, and then Teyashwani, medium level of exposure, and apologies if I'm pronouncing your name wrongly. Okay, that's great to know. So I think we have a little bit of a mixed bag here, right? So we'll go through some of the basics, and perhaps if we feel like we're going a little bit slow, we can speed up as we go. All right, so just trying to get myself back to the screen. Okay, so really monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and I'm going to sort of go with the MEL abbreviation going forward, boils down to 4 questions. So the first one is, what are you trying to do and how are you going to do it? So that is really the design part of monitoring and evaluation and learning. And why do you think it will work? That's really when you get into your project logic and your theory of change. So why is the activities that you plan to conduct going to lead to something or achieve something that you're trying to achieve? How will you know that you're succeeding? That's really when you get into the monitoring and evaluation piece of things, where you start collecting data. You really try to start having evidence to support your implementation and to understand how well you're doing. And then once you find out, what are you going to do about it? And that's really the learning piece. So just 1 second as I try to get back to my notes here. My apologies. 1 second. Okay, so okay, so I'm gonna go without notes for now and then find my way back as we move forward. So why do we do MEL? So it's first to learn, right? That's the first thing. It is to inform implementation in your ongoing programming, and it is to inform future programming as well. If you're doing a programming in one context and you want to do something similar in a different context, what you learn in the first project should inform what you do in your next project. And it's also to be accountable, right? And when we talk about accountability, we often think about funders. Those are the people that provide us with our resources. So it's really important that we stay accountable to our funders. But it's also really important that we stay accountable to our partners and the communities in which we work. So there's this study that was conducted a few years ago in the US where American drivers were asked to rate themselves. How good of drivers are they? And 64% of American drivers rated themselves as excellent or very good drivers. At the same time, they were asked to rate their friends and their driving abilities. And only 29% said that their friends are excellent or very good drivers. And there's sort of this broad literature in psychology, right? That really shows that we are masters of self-deception. We're always going to look at ourselves through a positive lens. We're always going to exaggerate the abilities that we have, the capabilities that we have, but also the work that we do, right? We're always going to look at that through a very positive lens. So that is why monitoring, evaluation, and learning is so important, that we bring in more objective measures of whether or not our program is succeeding. This is just kind of one study to show that idea that we're always going to see ourselves and our work in a very, very positive light. So if we only rely on our own, own observations, our own feelings around what our work is doing, we're always going to overplay how effective our programming is. That's why MEL is really important. So very quickly, a little bit about what MEL is, right? Monitoring, evaluation, and learning are things that should be feeding into each other. They're complements in your work, but they're also distinct in important ways. So monitoring is this process of assessing progress toward objectives through ongoing collection and analysis of data. So it's ongoing throughout project implementation. It really helps implementers to understand if the project is on track and then be able to adapt if necessary. If you learn that something isn't working the way you want it to work, you should be adapting what you do. Monitoring is conducted typically by an internal team, by the team implementing the program. Evaluation is essentially a process where you analyze why and how intended results of your programming were achieved or not. It's time bound, so it's typically done at the end of your project, and sometimes done midway through your project to learn and be able to adapt as you go. Key thing about evaluation is that it's resource intensive, right? So it's not something that you can go do throughout your project. Really needs to happen at these intervals, at these critical intervals in your programming. Evaluations can be conducted by internal or external teams. And of course, there's pros and cons to both having internal teams and external teams conducting your evaluation. And then finally, learning is this process where we bring all of our monitoring and evaluation data together with our experiences, right? We shouldn't completely discount our experiences. They're very important parts of learning as well. And where these are reflected on and used to kind of continuously improve your project. So learning should be a regular feature of project implementation, and it's typically done by an internal team. At least the end user, right, is the implementing team conducting the work. So a very basic illustration of the project cycle and how monitoring and evaluation and learning fits into that. So we start here at the solicitation and award stage. So when, for example, USAID puts out an RFA and an RFP, and you're in the process of responding to that solicitation, that is also where you should start developing your MEL plan. You should start thinking through what are we going to measure? How are we going to go about doing that? What is our approach to monitoring and evaluation? And that, of course, continues if you're awarded the contract or the grant. That is where you really start fleshing out your MEL plan and put in all the details. As you go through program implementation, you do the monitoring, right? So you do all of the day-to-day data collection, the ongoing data collection to understand whether or not you're making progress towards your objectives. And then at program closeout, you do an evaluation, but as mentioned, that can also happen earlier in the project cycle. And then at the very end of the project, you learn from your evaluation, you learn from your monitoring data and your experiences, and you put that into new projects, right? Into project conceptualization. But it's important to note that learning should be an ongoing process throughout your entire project. And that's what I'm trying to illustrate here with this inner circle. Learning should just be a part of what you're doing. You should be reflecting on both the data you're collecting and the experiences that you have on an ongoing basis. So before we move ahead, we're going to spend just a couple of minutes where I want you to reflect a little bit on learning, and in particular with your Women Connect Challenge India project. I want you to think about one key lesson or insight that you have learned from your project. And I also want you to kind of think through a couple of additional questions. The first one being, how was the lesson or insight identified? Was it through your experiences? Was it through monitoring and evaluation data explicitly, or was it sort of some combination of the two? And then I also want you to just think a little bit for a second, and this is not necessarily an easy question to answer, but how has the lesson or insight changed how your organization is implementing the program? So I just want you to take a few minutes to think about that, and then we might have some brave volunteers that might share out quickly what they have thought about. So let's give ourselves 4 minutes to do that, and then we'll get back to continuing. All right. Is there any questions about this task? Is it all clear? All right.
Hi, Ruben. Yeah, Dolan here. So, should I write it in the chat box?
No, so we'll just ask for a couple of you to share back some of your thoughts at the end.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so that's a little bit less than 4 minutes, but just in the interest of time, I just want to open it up to anybody that have thoughts on this, that want to share. Is there anybody that wants to share any reflections on these questions?
Yeah, hi, Ruben. This is Dolan from Anadi. So,
Hey, Dol.
should I go?
Yeah,
Yeah.
please go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah. So, one of the key lesson or insight that we have had from WCC India project that we are implementing for last 12 months. So it is the digital ways of income enhancement, or I mean livelihood generation is the key point that attracts women to uh, drag this training and percolate to the next level. So it's the I mean basically the point I want to focus is the through the digital training, the several ways that opens their livelihoods or enhances their livelihoods is the key point. And so this and coming back coming to the second question, how this lesson we have gathered. Yes, we have gathered in both the ways, like from field visit experiences, talking to the women, and also from the baseline and inline data we have gathered already for 2,700 women in the field. And then yes, from this lesson and insight, what we are doing, our organization is focusing, and basically we have identified 5 ways that women are preferring to enhance their livelihoods through these are the digital ways. Like one is digital marketing, another is e-payments, third is e-services, then fourth is e-commerce, And the last one is, yes, sorry, I'm missing out on the last point. I'll add it later if I am given the chance. So these are the 5 ways have been identified through the data that we have gathered and the analysis. So we are focusing particularly on these 5 points through which women can generate more income, and particularly we are trying to focus on that what were they doing on particularly these 5 sectors. Were they doing something earlier? Is it the value added services that the value added knowledge that we have provided, or they have completely adopted these 5 new ways of income generation? So it's the e-services. Sorry. So what are the 5 things? I'll just e-services, e-payments, e-commerce, digital marketing.
And another is the mobile and DTH recharge.
Yes, yes. The mobile and DTH recharge for the community and the family itself. Yeah.
Great.
So good to go. I think.
Yeah, I think. Thank you so much for sharing. It's such a great example of how actually doing data collection can really open up, right, your programming and make you really understand the context and really building out your program to be more holistic. And so thank you so much for sharing that, Dolan. Rahini wrote in the chat that yeah, that digital and tech is mostly a male world. So really starting working with women with very basic things and really getting them comfortable with the basics has been really important. So that's super helpful as well. Thank you guys for sharing that. I think it's always a little bit hard to sort of, come up with, okay, what was the key lesson or insight that we had? But I also think it's a really useful exercise to go through because it kind of forces you to think about, okay, what were some of the key things that we've learned from implementation? So we're going to move on then to talk about project logic for a little bit, and we're going to focus on the theory of change. So before we jump into the theory of change, I wanted to start with just a little bit of basic kind of vocabulary around this. So this is the spine of any project. When you put together a proposal, you really need to be able to articulate this chain well. And so we have our inputs, the resources, the financial and the human resources that we put into our project design. We have the activities that we intend to do, right? Activities are these tangible events that either we as an implementing organization or perhaps our partners on the ground will put on. That can be a training, that can be various different events. Outputs are the things that are directly generated from the activity. So if your activity is a training, an output could be the number of people trained, right? Outcomes, in this case, we're sort of defined it as the most immediate level of impact. So this is when you start to kind of address an identified problem, right? Any project starts from a problem statement, and this is where you really start kind of chipping away at the problem and trying to make a clear change to individuals, groups, communities, or institutions. And then higher level outcomes here is defined as the highest level of impact that the project can influence. I think when we talk about outcomes, we often talk about short-term outcomes, medium-term outcomes, higher level outcomes. I think the key here is that your project, the project that you sort of articulate, is going to have a number of different outcomes. Some of them are going to be a little bit shorter term. They're going to be a little bit easier to achieve. There's going to be the longer term outcomes that are, as the word says, they're going to be longer term, and they're also going to be a little bit more difficult to achieve, right? And then we have the goal, which we typically think about as a higher level purpose, this kind of north star for your project. Your contributing towards this, but your project is not going to be able to achieve the goal. It's just really that kind of purpose and vision for your project. And it's also really important to articulate, because that is like at the end of the day, sort of the reason why you do what you do, right? You're really pushing towards that goal and trying to contribute to it. Okay, so moving then to a theory of change. And what I want to do real quick, let's try this out. If Sharon, you could put question 2 on theories of change, that poll, if you could put that up on the screen and then just have everybody quickly respond to that question. Let's try that now, if that's possible. So this is a question about your experience in developing a theory of change. And I know that most, if not all of you, have some experience with this, but I just want to get a little bit more of a sense of how much work you've done in this space. I also see a response there from Smriti on this earlier question, so thank you for that as well. Gender digital divide is not just about affordability, but it's also about the mentality of male counterparts. That's a really good point. All right, and Sharon, when you have some responses back, feel free to share the responses.
Sharon or Ruthie, do we have some responses?
Yes, we do. Want to give it a couple more minutes. We have 8 people who have not filled out the poll.
Okay.
Okay, and as you guys do that, just in the interest of time, I'm gonna move forward with starting to talk a little bit about theories of change. So the most common way to articulate your project logic that we just talked about on the last slide is through a theory of change. And a theory of change is the explanation of how the project will create positive change. That's the bottom line of it. It serves as this bridge between a problem statement and the strategy of a program or project. So there's lots of ways that you can present a theory of change, but USA commonly asks for a narrative theory of change, so that you lay out in a narrative form what you believe your actions or activities are going to lead to. And that's what we have on this slide here. If we do X, right, we do a certain activity, then we believe that Y change will occur. But almost all of the time, right, your theory of change is going to be more complex than that. So we have at the bottom here sort of a more complex version of that world. I think the idea is when you develop a theory of change, though, you need to be really detailed in really laying out what are the steps in this causal chain that we call it. So what is it that will happen from your activities to the short-term outcomes to the longer-term outcomes, and being really explicit about that. So we're going to start by looking at a very basic example of a theory of change. So this is essentially the if here. The if statement is our activity, and organization X trains women entrepreneurs on basic literacy skills. Then we believe that in the short term, trained women entrepreneurs will adopt digital technology in their businesses. And in the medium to kind of longer term, business profits will increase. So this can feel a little bit formulaic, I think. But again, the key is to really lay out what you believe your activities will lead to. What is within your kind of sphere of influence, and what are you contributing towards? So this theory of change is very basic, right? So you can, and Sharon, sorry, just checking in on whether we have some or Ruthie, whether we have some responses at this point.
Yes, just send those over
All right.
to you.
Perfect. So I see that there's, again, a pretty big range of responses here, which is great. So we have a few people with no experience, quite a few people with some experience, and then also a few people with a lot of experience. So for you guys with a lot of experience, this might be a little bit basic, but please feel free also to chime in with your experiences developing theories of change. So I think this theory of change that is on the slide here can be made a lot more detailed, right? So let's look at what we could add to the mix here. So I think there's maybe a shorter term outcome than the short term outcome that we had here, right? So we have, we can add, if we do a training, we believe that greater digital literacy skills will be the result of that. And then from that, with greater digital literacy skills, women will adopt digital technology. We can add more clarity around how we believe that adoption of digital technology will lead to greater business profits. In this case, we're making it explicit that digital technology will help aid our business owners in building demand for products. And then even after the sort of medium-term outcome of business profits, it might follow that if businesses' profits increase, that might lead to business expansion and decreased unemployment in the areas in which we work. So again, key thing here is we need to be specific and detailed in the way we flesh out our theory of change. So let's quickly go through a theory of change exercise where I want you to fill in sort of the boxes here, the if, then, and sort of the longer term then outcome here. So we have a problem statement that reads as follows. So men in community X, a highly patriarchal community, are not supportive of women's use of digital technology. As a result, women do not really use digital technology, and that impedes women's inclusion in social and economic life. So I want you for a second to just think about what type of activity or activities would you design in order to try and get at this problem? And what do you think would result in the short term from conducting those activities? And then what do you think those short-term outcomes might lead to in the longer term? So just spend maybe a couple, 3 minutes on this, trying to lay out maybe a couple of activities or one activity, and then the outcomes that you expect to result from that. And if there's any question about this activity, please do let me know. Great, Rahini, thank you for that contribution. So Rahini's suggestion here is to start a digital library that women can have access to. They can come and use mobile phones, which can, and there can be folks there on the premises to help them use this technology. And the short-term outcome of that will be that women gain ease and familiarity with using digital technology. And the longer term outcome would be increased confidence of women in using digital technology and coming out with their own positions on use of these devices. Great. And Dolan is suggesting a community general meeting, incorporating the key influential leaders, I think is what you were saying here. Great. So I'm going to give folks another 30 seconds, and then we're just going to, if you have thoughts that you want to put into the chat, please feel free to do so. I'm just going to show kind of one example of what this could look like. Dolan is also adding a second activity, which is rapport building with local government to explain the importance, which I think is going in a slightly different direction from what Rahini did, right? It's sort of acknowledging that existing power structures in the community also needs to be made aware of this, ideally made champions of this. And so that's a great point. There's a few others ticking in. That's awesome. So I'm just going to show quickly one potential solution to this exercise. So the activity that I came up with is training community leaders on the importance of gender equality and digital technology's role in furthering gender equality. Then if we do that training, community leaders will have increased understanding of the importance of providing access to digital technology to women. Community leaders will champion this mindset with their constituents, creating increased support for adoption of digital technology among women. So the focus of my theory of change is very much focused on community men, community leaders in the communities. And so that's probably just one part of the equation. Some of you guys were talking about how we actually need to build the skills of women, equally important, right? So maybe these things need to happen in parallel. So that's great. And yeah, Dolan, you were kind of going in a similar direction to me, sort of building community change agents.
Correct.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, correctly said. I just second you on this, that building community change agents is the empowering, identification of the N2 cutlets, and then empowering them, let them know what it is, the digital divide, and then percolate the messages throughout the community with the help of these leaders.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and there's a couple of other comments that come in. Gender sensitization trainings to both male as well as female counterparts. So yeah, I think it's sort of like a two-lane type of problem that we're working on, right? So it's low digital literacy skills as well as a community that is not open to the use of technology among women. And so you kind of have to tackle this problem from both sides. All right, so I wanted to just quickly, before we wrap up the part about theories of change, just really quickly talk about assumptions, because I think it's actually critically important. In any theory that we put together, there's going to be assumptions baked in. And so when you develop your project design and your theory of change, it's really important to keep these in mind. Assumptions are typically outside the control or only partly in the control of your project, and it impacts the project and its ability to achieve its objectives, right? So it's something that we can't really control, but it's going to impact how our project goes. So let's just look at a couple of examples of what assumptions could look like. And we've gone all the way back now to our most basic layout of a theory of change. So one assumption that we're sort of making here is that first, an assumption before the assumption is that we're assuming that our basic literacy, our training on basic literacy will increase skills, but we're also assuming, really critically important, that increased skills will lead to adoption of technology. And that is actually a really big theory or assumption, right? That doesn't actually always hold. We see that in the real world, that building skills doesn't always lead to behavior change. So it's an important assumption and something that we really need to be careful about because it's a big one. And then we have another assumption here, which is between the adoption of digital technology and business profits. Of course, kind of a clear implicit assumption that we made here is that the lack of digital technology is a major barrier to business success, right? And the adoption of digital technology will by itself be enough to lead to greater profits. So both of these assumptions are significant, and if they don't hold, the whole project may not actually be able to deliver the expected results. So of course, we try to minimize the number of assumptions and maybe the strength of the assumptions, by doing rigorous research, right? Doing rigorous assessments, really trying to understand the context in which we're operating in. But we can never really fully eradicate assumptions from our theory of change. They're always going to be there, and they're typically quite consequential. So when you develop your theory of change, you really need to flesh out the assumptions, really identify them, and then be able to monitor them as you go through your program. As you do your training, let's say, and going back to this theory of change here, as you do your training and you see increased skills result from that training, but you don't see the adoption of digital technology on the back end. You know that something is wrong with your theory of change. That assumption didn't hold. So now you need to adapt your programming in some shape or form, right? So just very quickly, sort of a quick note on assumptions, but that shouldn't mask the fact that it's actually really, really important. So any questions on theories of change, or any thoughts or comments on theories of change before we move on to indicators?
Hi, this is Vicky. I just wanted to sort of ask one question, and also I just had a comment. So my question was, when you were talking about assumptions, sometimes when you write proposals, obviously, you're expected to put down a theory of change. Also, there is a section sometimes on risks and how are you going to mitigate the risks. So the assumptions and the risks, sometimes I find the line is very thin, or they actually almost overlap. So, can you help sort of understand how to distinguish these two?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I agree, they're very much overlapping. So I oftentimes think about assumptions as it's almost like flip sides of each other, right? So an assumption is, this is something that we believe needs to hold in order for our project to work. Risk is kind of the flip side, where you start thinking about, if this theory does, or if this assumption doesn't hold, what are the risks that will come from it? So risks are kind of what happens if your assumption doesn't hold. So we think about, when we lay out our theory of change, we lay out our assumptions, but we also need to think about, okay, so if this assumption doesn't hold, what is going to happen, and how are we going to mitigate any issues related to that assumption not holding? I hope that's clear. It's actually a pretty sort of fine line between those two. Risk is really what happens when your assumption doesn't hold.
Right. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Great.
And
I also, sorry, Rahini, I think there's also going to be risks that you should write down in your proposals that doesn't pertain specifically to your theory of change. So there might be other risks, right? That there might be significant risks related to things that isn't necessarily within your theory of change. So there might be things around resources, there might be things around, contextual things that isn't included in your theory of change. You might have more risks than you have assumptions, if that makes sense.
Correct. Yeah, I can already think of an example. We also have agriculture projects, and over there, one of the risks that we always state upfront is weather. It's not in our control at all, but it really impacts agriculture results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
And if I may add a comment, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I feel very strongly about it, so I just want to share it with everybody.
Yeah.
Is that when we first, and this was I think back almost 15 years ago, we were writing a proposal for a USAID grant, and there was a theory of change thing, and it was very new for us, and we found it, oh my God, we found it very cumbersome and so on. But I'm grateful for that, because as we went along, whether a donor is asking for it or not, we do this exercise because it helps us really think logically. And we often find that if we are not thinking in this manner, we unnecessarily complicate our work or our activities, and it's very easy to sort of streamline. Okay, why am I doing this particular activity? Is it leading somewhere to that? No, then let's not do it. It really helps to streamline our work and our sort of process of thinking. So yeah, that's what I wanted to share.
That's a really helpful comment, and I fully agree with that. I think sometimes some people might feel like it's a little bit limiting to put together kind of this narrative theory of change that is like if and then statements. And so I would just encourage you, if you're a visual person, if you're somebody that likes to see things sort of visually in front of you, it's also completely fine to develop more visual types of theories of change. When you're sitting with your team, you're kind of thinking through, okay, what are we going to be doing and why are we going to do it? Use other means to develop your theory of change. And then at the end, when you put it into your proposal, you sort of transform it into the format that the funder is looking for. Because I personally think that working with narrative theories of change is not always the best way for me, at least initially. I need to see it visually. I need to be able to really flesh it out in detail. And so that's just another note on that. But yes, I totally agree. Overall, working with theories of change is just so incredibly important. It really just forces you to really answer this question of why are we even doing this, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So let's jump into indicators, and we have a little bit limited time now, so I'm going to try and run through some of this quite quickly. So indicators, right, they're in the context of monitoring and evaluation. An indicator is a quantitative metric that provides information to monitor performance, measure achievement, and determine accountability. And so going a little bit deeper on this, an indicator measures the intended changes that we believe is attributable to your project or to our project. It observes progress and performance at any level of your project. It helps answer how or if you're progressing towards objectives, but it doesn't tell you why. And I think that's really important to note here. An indicator is just telling you, did this happen or did it not, but doesn't tell you how or why you got there. And indicators are typically compared to baselines, that is research that happens before your program starts, and then to targets as well. And we're going to talk a little bit more about targets in a second. So what are the elements of an indicator? So this is a table like this is something that you're going to see when you are putting together a MEL plan for USAID, for example. The columns might be slightly different. There might be some other things that are being asked about. But in general terms, these are the elements that you need to include in your MEL plan. So you need to put in indicator language, right? And that should include what is going to be measured, what is going to change, the unit of measurement, is it a number, is it a percentage, and the direction of change, is it an increase, a decrease, etc. Then you also need to include data source. Where is the data going to come from? You need to include the method to collect data on this indicator. So is it through surveys, interviews, focus groups, observation, and so on and so forth. And then you need to add information about the frequency of data collection. When is data going to be collected? And then finally, you should try and develop a target for your indicator. That is really the threshold value of an indicator that will signal to you and to your funder and other folks that you're accountable to that the goal of, or that we reached our aims for this particular indicator. And then you're oftentimes also asked for a baseline value of your indicator. Again, this is before your program starts. What is the value of the indicator at that point? So let's just look a little bit about how indicators and theories of change are connected. And we're going to go back to our very, very basic example, right? So this again is our activity here. Organization X is planning to train women entrepreneurs on basic literacy skills. And indicators for that could be number of women trained on digital literacy. It could be number of trainings on digital literacy skills. Both are equally valuable and perhaps can both be included in the MEL plan, right? Since this is an activity, the indicator is an output indicator. It's just the direct sort of results of your training. And in this case, this is the most kind of direct results. We're going to train, so therefore, we have a number of trainings. And so it's really important for your output indicators that you have clearly set targets at the start. Given the resources available and sort of prior knowledge and experience, how many women do we think we can train? And then you need to put that target into your indicator table and be able to sort of look at progress. Are we meeting the targets that we had? And then we have the then statement, the short-term outcome. And one indicator for this adoption of digital technology could be percentage of trained participants that adopt digital technology in their business. But there is an issue with this indicator, right? It sort of standing by itself, adoption of digital technology is not very clear at all. So we really do need to define terms and be really clear about what we mean by adoption. Another option could be that where we get a little bit closer, a little bit more detailed, is percentage of trained participants that adopt online tools for marketing their products. At least here, we're talking about an online tool. It is a marketing tool. But of course, the more detailed you can be with your indicators. If you're doing training on a particular digital tool, that should just be included right into this indicator, right? So tool X is being adopted by our participants. We train them on that. Great. We're seeing what we want to see. And then finally, the longer or the medium term kind of outcome here is business profits. And an indicator for that could be percentage of businesses with increased annual profits. You'll note here, right, that we have increased in our indicator. And so we need to compare it to something. In this case, we need to compare it to some sort of baseline value of business profits for these organizations, or for these women entrepreneurs, sorry. So just in the interest of time, we're going to skip this indicator exercise. I'm going to go right to a solution for this indicator. So we see that we have an outcome that is increased tolerance for women's use of digital technology among men in community X. And an indicator for this could be percentage increase in the number of men that accept women's use of technology. We're going to be talking to men in community X. We're going to conduct a representative survey, and we're going to collect data twice throughout project, baseline and endline. And then when it comes to the target, you need to ask yourself some key questions, right? First off, what is the prevalence of the problem? How deeply ingrained are existing sentiments in the community? The more ingrained these sentiments are, the lower your target should be, right? And you should also ask yourself questions around your project. What scale is it operating at? Is it a large scale intervention? Is it smaller in nature? And also you should think back at experiences that you've had in other contexts. What have we learned from implementing similar projects in other contexts? Can that help us determine a reasonable target for this indicator? Just very quickly, a couple of types of indicators that we often see when we work with USAID, or we always see when we work with USAID. It's standard indicators, which is essentially a long list that you can find online, and I'll have some links to that, that essentially have a number of indicators for all of their thematic areas. So it's hundreds of indicators. These indicators are being collected across the world by different implementing partners using the same methods to collect the information, right? So that's really helpful for USAID because it means that they can aggregate these indicators up and be able to report on it to their funders, which is the US Congress. And so these indicators are something that USAID always wants you to report on to the extent possible. And then in addition to that, you have custom indicators, which supplements USAID's list of standard indicators. It's often used in combination with standard indicators for more complex results. When it's something that you need to look at from multiple different angles, you often add in custom indicators to better understand whether or not you're reaching or achieving a result that is quite complex. And of course, custom indicators are used when no standard indicator exists for a given result. So again, given time, I think I'm going to skip over this section here on sort of measurement challenges. I'll share this slide deck with you afterwards, and hopefully it's sort of somewhat self-explanatory. We're going to talk a little bit about capacity building programs and some of the challenges related to measurement of those, and then also talk a little bit about higher level outcomes in international development more broadly, how it's just very difficult to collect data on those, have a precision and accuracy. And so let's jump into the last section, which is just really some tips and hints for conducting monitoring, evaluation, and learning with USAID, especially at the planning phase. So the first thing we're going to talk about is just at the solicitation stage. This is when, again, USAID puts out an RFA or an RFP, and you're in the process with your organization to provide a response to that solicitation. MEL requirements often are not very burdensome at the stage of concept notes and proposals, but it will vary quite a bit, right? So, but regardless of what you're being asked for at this stage in terms of MEL information, it's still really important that you start thinking about your MEL plan at this stage and really start fleshing out the details of it, even at the solicitation stage. Because if you put some, even if you're asked for maybe 2 paragraphs on your MEL plan and what you're planning to do with MEL, if you haven't thought about the details, your narrative might not make a lot of sense. And I think even worse, right? You may be over-promising and under-delivering in your proposal if you haven't really carefully thought through what is required to do what you're promising to do. Another piece here that goes without saying, really, you need to read the solicitation really carefully. What information about MEL is being required? Provide only that, right? Don't write 2 pages about MEL if you're asked for a couple of paragraphs. But again, just emphasizing the point I made just now, that you need to, on the back end, not necessarily in your concept note or proposal, but with your team, really start thinking about what is MEL going to look like for this project already at this stage. You need to resource your MEL adequately. I think a good rule of thumb for putting together enough resources to have a solid MEL framework is 5 to 8% of the overall project budget. I think some USAID counterparts might not, be happy with that number. They might think it's too much resources for MEL. But I think in international development as a whole, that kind of discussion is changing and evolving a little bit, and I think it's becoming more and more acceptable to add significant resources to your MEL because it's seen as increasingly more and more important. And of course, foundational to any good proposal, you need to clearly link your project logic, the problem, your intervention, and the intended outcomes. And USAID will always provide guidance on the types of, first on the problem they're seeking to address, and then the types of results that they want to see. And you need to ensure that your approach, what you're going to be doing, is in close alignment with what they're putting forth. And then very quickly on the award stage itself. So when you have been successful in your solicitation response, you've been awarded a contract or a grant, you're going to be asked to put together an activity monitoring, evaluation, and learning plan, which is typically due sort of 90 days after your award is given. And so the process of developing the AMEL plan requires significant time and resources. This is where all the details of your approach ends up, right? So you need to flesh out your monitoring plan. What are you going to do in your ongoing data collection? Evaluation plan, where you really describe the approach to evaluation. Collaboration, learning, and adapting approach, which is really USAID speak for learning. But it's also sort of a little bit of a new way of thinking about learning, and there's a lot of resources about that on their website. And so really thinking about your CLA approach, resources that you need to do various different MEL tasks, roles and responsibilities, schedule for MEL plan tasks and deliverables. And in the annex, a really, really important component that you need to fill out in a lot of detail is the indicator summary table. And that's going to look, again, similar to the types of tables that we've been looking at in this session. But this is where you add in all of the indicators that you're going to be tracking throughout implementation. And you need to provide detail about how you're going to collect it, targets, et cetera, et cetera. So with that, I think, Ritesh, just in the interest of time, I'm going to pass it back to you. If there's any questions, feel free to add them in the chat, and I'm happy to follow up with you on the back end of this session. But I just don't want us to go too far over Does that sound right, Ritesh?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Ruben. Well, there is a question from the theory of change discussion, which I thought if you could take a minute to answer. So it was from Smriti Das, and she says that, sometimes outputs and outcomes of a particular activity may not be the same as initially sort of planned. So is it possible to build in that sort of a flexibility in theory of change? So,
That's such a great question. And I would argue that you should have that type of flexibility built into your theory of change. I was just talking about the activity monitoring and evaluation and learning plan, where you also add in your theory of change. And as part of that plan, you also have a change log, it's called, where essentially you're encouraged to make changes to your MEL plan as you go along. And that includes the theory of change as well. As you learn new things, as you implement your program, as you learn sort of more about the environment that you're operating in, you should be making changes. You should be adapting your approach, because it's very unlikely, unless you have just incredibly deep knowledge of the local context, that everything that you've laid out is going to work exactly as you planned in the real world. So I would say, to that question, I think that is more and more being encouraged. I think some organizations now are essentially quarterly coming together to discuss their theory of change and make updates to it based on what they're learning. And so a theory of change should be a learning tool. It should always be evolving.
thank you for that, Ruben. So yeah, thank you so much. And I just wanted to sort of also mention to everyone that Ruben is just out of COVID and still took the time to design this and sort of share his learnings with us. So doubly grateful for you for that, Ruben. We have Mariam with us, who's the male advisor for the Indo-Pacific office, USAID Indo-Pacific office. Mariam, would you want to sort of maybe quickly share a few thoughts, if possible for you?
Yeah, thank you, Ritesh, and thank you, Ruben. I think you have covered very briefly, very quickly, means like seeing the time constraint, you have covered most every time, most of the MEL, features and the benefits, and so you have covered very nicely, I think so. But then the last question that they, Ritesh, have asked is the change in the your plan or a change. But then I think I want to highlight this thing here, that the change should not be, it should be saying that we will be learning throughout our plan or project cycle. It should be based on that experience, not that to adjust our a progress, right? So it should not be adjusting our progress, that if we are not getting the target, so we are changing that plan or the theory of change. So it should be based on the learnings. And other than that, as Ruben already mentioned, that MEL is most important, not just from the point of view of the the USAID is asking or some agency is asking, but for the individual as an agency who is implementing partners, who is implementing the plan, you set the target, and it should be monthly, or not if monthly, but the quarterly should be reviewed, and your tracking should be there. The tracking of your progress should be there, but which is a continuous thing. It should not be the end of the year, or it's not because of we have to report somewhere. It should be for us who is implementing, whether the intended target we are achieving, whether the benefit is achieving to the intended person or participants. If we are talking about the trained person, so whether we are training are we targeting the right person, or which the project is identified. So that type of questions we have to every quarter. I will focus on the monthly basis, but then if not possible for the monthly basis, based on the activity that the project is focusing, it should be on a regular basis or a quarterly basis, and a proper meeting of the should be there, not for the other agency outside, but the inside also, and then doing the analysis what we are doing, whether we have achieved, and it should be a continuous thing. So this is what I want to just give a more focus on this. It should be continuous. It should not. It should be for specific. Yeah.
Got it,
I think
Mariam. Thank you.
Ritesh, I want to add this thing. Yeah.
Sure, sure. Thank you so much, Mariam, for that thoughtful observation. Mariam is on the road. She's traveling, so there is a bit of a sort of static over there.
Yeah.
But if
Sorry.
any,
Lots of must be
no,
lots of noise.
but I think you made a very valid point, and I just wanted to mention to everyone that I'm sure you may have a lot of questions for
Coming there.
Ruben, for Mariam, and if you all want to reach out to them, I mean, I'm happy to facilitate discussions, conversation, or even take your questions to Mariam and Ruben. Thank you so much, both of you, Ruben and Mariam, for your inputs. I just wanted to say that this was the last event of the Speaker Series 2.0, and it's been a great journey so far. Thank you, everyone, for being patient with us, engaging with us every time we had an event, and we hope to be back with a new series. So thank you so much, and have a good evening.